So my name is Dustin Thompson. I am with the Delaware Sierra Club. Thank you all for joining us today. We're being joined by the wonderful Mr. Milton Muldrow from Wilmington University Department of Science. And before he goes in and gives us his kind of a background, I want to start out. Today we're going to be talking a lot about coral. And when Milton and I were talking a little bit earlier, the question kind of arose as what is coral? And I admittedly had never stopped to think about it. And then when he asked me though, I was like, yeah. So I went online and apparently this is the thing. Like people, there's a lot of misconceptions about what coral is. And so we're going to do our first ever live poll. And the question is, what do you think coral is? So the poll is going to launch on Zoom here in a second. You have three choices. Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Or is it a mineral? And so if you're on Facebook and you're watching and you want to participate in the poll, what do you think coral is? Is it a plant? Is it an animal or a mineral? Feel free to drop your answer in the comment. And here goes the poll. And while that's in process, Milton, why don't you give us a little background on yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Milton Muldrow. My background, I'll try not to bore you all too much. Originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Always been interested in biology and the study of life generally. I think what initially got me hooked was as a kid, tropical biology in particular was filled with mystery and monsters. And I think that's what attracted me till this day. There's so much mystery. The vast majority of species are still unknown in these systems. And there's lots to find, there's lots to see, and there's lots to fall in love with. So, I took my passion for the study of life to St. Francis University, where I received a Bachelor of Science in Biology, and to the University of Missouri, and finally to George Mason University, where I received a PhD. In my current role, I'm currently the department chair in the science department at Wilmington University. We also recently started a biology and environmental science and policy degree. So that's been great fun.
Wonderful, I appreciate it. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll here. So for all those that said that coral was a plant or an animal on Facebook, actually, Milton, why don't you go ahead and give it to us? What is coral?
Well, honestly, that question, because it can involve different parts. Coral are in a group called cnidarians. These are animals that have a body plan that's a ring of tentacles. So think of sea anemones, right? Or jellyfish. Jellyfish is this ring of tentacles, except upside down. So you have this ring of tentacles with these stinging cells called nematocysts that aid in its capture of food. And those tentacles bring the food in to its gastrovascular cavity. So corals are an animal. However, corals can have living plant or algal rather cells in its tissue, which can aid in its color patterns. The algae provides sugars and so on for the coral itself, while the coral provides a habitat. But coral, stony coral, can also secrete mineral. So it's a bit of a tricky question, but there's my stab at it.
So are we saying everybody's wrong or everybody's right?
Animals most right. Yep, animal. It is an animal. Yep.
All right, so you and I have spoke a little offline, and some of the stuff that you've been said has been pretty profound about what's happening to our coral populations. And I know I've read some things online and some articles, but I'd love for you to kind of give some background on what our coral populations are facing right now in the United States and even globally.
Well, I'll also mention, so you have coral, the animal, and then you have coral reefs, the ecosystem. So coral reefs are the most diverse ecosystems on the planet in terms of number of taxa that are there. They supply habitat both directly or indirectly for a quarter of ocean species. So they're incredibly important. So coral also facing, mounting challenges. And I would say the primary one, although there are others, is climate change. If you look at what's been going on with our climate over the last several years, this year alone is already shaping up to be one of the hottest years on record. Last year was the warmest year, the second warmest year on record. The last 10 years were the hottest 10 years combined. So there's an obvious pattern. If you look at the Greenland ice sheet, there was a recent study that was just published that says, the Greenland ice sheet is already past this tipping point, meaning there's very little we could do to stop it from melting. So what we're trying to do now is stop the tipping point for corals, which would have, incredible impact. So the reason that climate change affects corals is because, first of all, corals tend to exist in relatively narrow ranges of temperature. So, even slight fluctuations in temperature can stress the coral and cause bleaching. Second of all, climate change induces ocean acidification, because the more CO2 we put in the atmosphere, the more CO2 gets dissolved in our oceans, creating carbonic acid and lowering the pH of corals. It was, a recent publication in Science magazine that says corals may enter a net dissolving state by the end of the century, meaning, again, remember, coral secrete its own limestone substrate. So by the end of the century, it's at least under threat that corals will not be able to keep up with its rate of dissolution as compared to how fast it can grow. So the problem is serious and is urgent, particularly given how important corals are.
Yeah, so two questions on that. I think I've seen the pictures of, bleached reefs. What does that process entail? Can you just give us like a little bit on that?
Sure. So we touched on the fact that coral, the animal, the polyp, right, the cnidarian, the tentacled organism, has a relationship with algae, right? So algae are often housed in the coral tissue, the living tissue, and can supply at times over 90% of its food. But when temperatures fluctuate, when the corals are stressed, that relationship is broken. And scientists are still trying to figure out exactly how and why that happens. But we'll probably get into genetics in a little bit, but that relationship is severed, causing bleaching. And so when you've seen those pictures of vast seascapes of white corals, because the coral has lost its algal symbiont, and it can recover from that process, but it often doesn't, and it dies. And so when it dies, the tissue layers die, and what's left is this white skeleton, this white limestone skeleton, which itself starts to erode over time. And therefore, when we lose coral, it's not just the immediate loss of the animal, but also the substrate on which coral reefs, the ecosystems, are built upon. So it's this, these problems are compounding, let's say.
So give us a kind of a picture. What would ocean life or the world be like without coral reefs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we mentioned that, a quarter of life in the oceans are dependent on corals, either directly or indirectly. And before I go on this, this exhaustive list of the industrial contributions of coral, if we lost coral reefs, this magical ecosystem, that is a loss. Think about it. Let's make this comparison. Why do people go to the Grand Canyon? If I can ask you that, Dustin.
I mean, I gotta say, I went to the Grand Canyon actually for the first time only a couple of years ago, and it's like mind-boggling. Not only the view, obviously the view is mind-boggling. You literally can't. It's impossible to take it in, but the connection that you feel. Maybe I'm a bit of a hippie here, but the connection that you feel to the earth in a space that big there's nothing else like it.
Nothing else like it. So it wasn't because of its industrial contributions or its addition to GDP?
No.
Well, first of all, it would suck not to have one of the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. It would be terrible, for my kids and grandkids eventually, not to have the option to visit or explore these magical places. That's first and foremost. However, there are some practical reasons why we would want coral beyond its beauty and its diversity and its intrinsic value. Number one, millions of people, particularly poor people, are dependent on corals for their source of protein on a daily basis. So it would cause loss of food. If you think about America's barrier reef, the reef off the coast of Florida provides lots of money due to tourism, the fishery, everything from lobster and snapper and so on, are dependent on these reefs. And so a life or a world without corals would be absolutely tragic. If you look at our solar system, the nearest and most hospitable place is Mars. A barren landscape without an atmosphere. Earth, as far as we know, as far as we've been able to find, is truly unique in its diversity and its ability to support life. So to squander something like that will be tragic. There's also, up to 90% of the species there have yet to be discovered in and around the reef. All the worms, mollusks, and crustaceans, and so on, have not yet to be discovered. So we're not quite sure what we'd lose. Perhaps the cure for cancer, perhaps the next great antibiotic. The list goes on and on.
That sounds very similar to, and I think, maybe even some of the plights are very similar to that of the rainforest.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
The vast majority of the rainforest, which you can see burning and degradation maybe a little bit more often than we see with regard to coral, but it sounds very similar to what you're describing.
I think so. I think there's a lot of correlation. And I started my career wanting to study the rainforest. And as a matter of fact, for my master's thesis, I studied a tropical forest in the Florida Keys. But there's a lot of connection. And in some ways, the destruction of the rainforest, even though it's probably not near any of us today, is more apparent. But the corals are under the sea. Even when I used to work on a small island in the Florida Keys, and we would take students out to the reef, and they would see all the colorful fish, and they would be amazed. Every once in a while, we would see a nurse shark or something like that. But the vast majority of the reef was already dead that we had gone to visit. And it was hard for them to recognize that, given their lack of baseline or comparison, because it's just not always very present.
So we've had a couple questions from the audience I'd love to get to. One coming in from Facebook, what is the, if you know, what is the current percentage of coral that we've lost already?
Well, we've lost a lot, and that depends on the individual site. There's many different pockets of the world that has coral, in the tropics, that is. So if you take my system in the Florida Keys, one reef in particular, Lou Key is called, had, in the early 80s, the percent of the sea floor was, 30, low 30% coral. Now it's in the single digits. So, some places, particularly in the Keys and other places in the Caribbean, have seen, upwards of 90+% loss of corals. And for the more pristine places, the Indo-Pacific, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia had fared a bit better for a period of time, although we're seeing it degrade more quickly over time as well.
So what are the chances, and we're going to talk a little bit about restoration in a minute, but is there, without getting too into it, is there a chance that restoration efforts will be successful enough to overcome the loss that you're describing here?
I think there's always a chance for something. To date, restoration, that is gluing, corals that were grown in an aquarium, or, tied to a string if they're branching corals in the ocean, and then, gluing them or placing them back in the ocean, has seen mixed results, especially after, 5 to 10 years. A lot of that coral hasn't fared well. It hasn't made it. Some newer techniques involve, trying to select coral based on their robust traits. So the Gates Lab, for example, in Hawaii, has done a lot of that work, in which they go out and they find coral in degraded sites, and they try to grow them, because obviously if that one was still there, well, maybe it's more robust or resilient to change. So to date, it's received mixed results, although we're learning more every year about the basic biology of coral to try to increase those outcomes. But
so is it a chance to kind of move coral to cooler waters for preservation? Is that one of the methods that are being used?
Well, to disrupt the temperature regime of the whole ecosystem, to me, doesn't seem very likely. Now, on smaller scales, can you move stuff around? Sure, but to supplant coral to a whole different, like a complex ecosystem, remember, the vast majority of which we don't know, to another, to a place with different physical conditions, to me seems iffy. Now, coral have been around for a long time, since, the Cambrian explosion, we call it, 500 million years plus. And the world has seen lots of changes in that time. So to me, that's one of the biggest or most significant bastions of hope that I have. They've been around a heck of a lot longer than I have, and probably will be. So there may be some inherent mechanisms. Refugia, for example, something I think you're getting to. Can coral kind of survive in different pockets of the earth as it changes and, reemerge under more favorable conditions. That's all possible. And when we say coral will go extinct, I don't think that we'll lose every species of coral. And as a matter of fact, marine extinction is relatively rare in those habitats. What we see is a decline in populations to where it's no longer functions like a coral reef, if that makes sense. It doesn't have the ecosystem benefits, and it can't benefit as many species, perhaps leading to more extinctions over time.
So you've recently published a paper on all of this. So can you kind of walk us through what came out of the research and what made it into that?
Sure. So, there's been a big topic in conservation biology for a period of time, and that was around this issue of shifting baselines, and I touched on them before. Shifting baseline syndrome, as it's called, a term coined by Dr. Daniel Pauly, says that, people accept as a baseline what they see, right? Or they tend to. So for example, if you were a kid and you fished off the same dock as your dad, and the fish that you caught tended to be 6 inches, although the fish that your dad caught tended to be 12 inches, well, the kid may accept that as his baseline. It may say, hey, I caught a 6-incher today rather than a 4-incher, and that's good. I had a good day. So by the time he raises his kid, what he passes down is a different standard, perhaps. And so there's been evidence that has been happening in the general public. Although we wanted to test this on scientists, is shifting baselines really an issue in the scientific community? And, Daniel Pauly's original paper was targeted to fishery scientists. So, is this happening? Because as you can imagine, if scientists themselves were changing their standards on what was acceptable, so to speak, then that might be concerning. So we did the study and we didn't find evidence for shifting baselines among coral reef scientists, which may suggest that experts are more robust to shifting baselines, which makes sense because they spend a lifetime immersed in the science and should be looking back at what's more appropriate. However, we did find some interesting patterns of concern. For instance, we found that 70% of scientists under the age of 40 had never even witnessed a coral reef in the Florida Keys dominated by what's called aquaporid corals, or these branching corals that really help to define that segment of the reef. And so what we're seeing now is scientists entering fields of study with their ecosystems of interest already gone. So we do have to keep a watchful eye on these standards and to make sure they're not degraded. However, another thing that the study tried to assess is, okay, what is the baseline? What is the standard for the Florida Keys reef in terms of percent cover of coral on the seafloor? How many years past should we consider the baseline to be? But there's another problem, which is we don't know what was there past a few decades before scuba was widely used. So we can come up with these metrics so we can set policy, but baselines in marine biology are awful hard to come by, although they're important to examine so we can say what is appropriate, are our efforts successful, how pristine is this habitat or not, if we can even get a real answer to that question.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Well, let me rephrase that. I would definitely hope that it was the case that they would not be keen to keep moving that baseline in
Mhm.
a migratory way, given that science often is in looking back through time to kind of keep moving forward, which is
Yeah, so I think the silver lining is education. I think since experts can hold the line, so to speak, right? They can hold the baseline and say, look, no, this is what's appropriate. And they can inform the general public. That may also suggest that education and outreach can really set a standard and prevent baselines from shifting, prevent us from accepting what is appropriate and not. That's one of the biggest things that came out of the study to me, especially since shifting baselines is such a concern. We should continue to do our best to inform the general public on what was, what is, and what is to come.
yeah, right. Yeah, if we have to learn from history, and we
Mhm.
have to do better moving forward. And that, whether we're talking about coral or climate, or and
Mhm.
not that those two things are entirely separate. But so we had somebody that asked about sunscreen, but more broadly than just that. I know that's an issue. It was actually in the news. I was reading an article yesterday or the day before, actually, about from Mexico. But what are humans doing that is contributing to coral degradation, and what can we do better in our daily lives to stop it?
Yes, that's a great question. I know sunscreen has been a big issue. Policy has already been set around sunscreen, and biologists are still trying to understand the mechanisms, the particular mechanisms that may affect coral, due to sunscreen. But generally, humans are having a direct effect, right? When we visit the reef, are we trashing it? Are we kicking it? Are we standing on it? Right? Are we running our boats into it? There's water quality. In the Florida Keys, this reef, perhaps more than many others, are highly influenced by water quality because the runoff of fertilizers from farms in South Florida, run into the Florida Bay and out to the reef, and cause disease and decline and algal blooms. So water quality is affected by it. So, and that's policy. If we can set policy and assist farmers in addressing some of those issues, and some of that work is being done to redirect water and to assist farmers, particularly in South Florida. But obviously, more needs done. Some policy had been set in the Florida Keys because their septic systems, people's septic systems would leak and cause a decline in water quality. But the decline of corals is a global issue. Therefore, what I do, me personally, affects corals all around the world. And what all of us do collectively by contributing to climate change, by release of greenhouse gases, um, causing warming to increase over time, pH to decrease due to ocean acidification. These are global issues. Therefore, they're going to require broad and substantial changes to how we live our lives to have a measurable effect on what ultimately happens with corals.
Yeah, we had a live stream a couple weeks ago that was talking about kind of inundation of chemicals in our daily lives, and
Mhm.
the speaker reflected that he often gets questions on kind of, is this mouthwash bad, or is this is this packaged food bad, or these individual products, which he's say he's happy to answer. But when we gotta step back and think about in a much broader way, as you're kind of describing now with policies related to the environment and our world. And
Mhm.
we have to look at this picture. It's hard to do,
Mhm.
admittedly, right? It's much easier to say, well, I'm not going to use that chemical because that chemical goes into the water and it directly attributes to coral with degradation, which you obviously you should do that.
Mhm.
if your chemical does that. But we really gotta, as you're saying, we gotta think big on this.
I agree.
Those numbers you threw out are crazy.
Yeah, I agree. I think I don't want to minimize individual action, but the rate of decline of many ecosystems, even collapse of entire ecosystems around the world, is such that we really are going to have to work together as a global community. Now, we should individually do as best we can because people follow other people. So, don't get too discouraged about, um, you know, if I recycle this, or, if I take the bus, is that really going to make a difference? You should, and you should share what you're doing. On top of that, you should support policies and politicians that support policy that addresses these issues. Bottom line.
Yeah, excellent. And that's why you should get involved in county stuff as well. Land use
Absolutely.
matters.
Absolutely.
So without getting too into it. So I want to, we're on the top of the half hour here, and I appreciate your time and want to respect everybody's time, but you're doing so much, and I feel like we got to also hit on this. So you're one of the associate directors of the NASA Delaware Space Grant.
Mhm.
And again, we spoke a little bit about that, but I'd love for you to share with everybody what you're doing there, because it's pretty impressive.
I would love to. Thank you. Space Grant is a great organization. So Space Grant is a NASA program. And throughout the country, there's these different space grant programs. And we happen to have one in Delaware, which is terrific. And the goal of Space Grant is to further science and education, which is really the goal of NASA. And in Delaware Space Grant, you have all these different institutions that are working on different projects with students to solve different problems or have different experiments and projects and so on. The one at WilmU is centered around coral reefs. And so for the past several years, students have conducted projects. The first one was a GIS project in which one student who's amazing created hundreds of maps in which she detailed or developed GIS maps to illustrate the decline of corals over time using these bubbles and things on a map, or heat maps, and so on and so forth. As of recent, we've been examining coral genomics. So, one of the issues with coral decline is, okay, what do we do? And for me, I've crossed the bridge to say, hey, we may at least need to consider or start to examine the use of genetics and genetic engineering to assist these species. Not because it's ideal, but because the rate of decline is such that we may want to be prepared to deploy some of these technologies if need be. So I've been working with students to develop the methods in order to do this using a technique called CRISPR. So we just had a Space Grant meeting before this that ended at around 2:20. I was like, all right, I gotta go. But this summer we're all remote, although we have still been able to be productive and to start to develop novel methods to address that. And of course, there's still many questions about the basic biology and genetics of coral. What are the major genes that confer resilience and resistance and so on and so forth? So there's still some basic questions that need to be answered, but we're still looking into it.
But it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about what may need to be at least on some basis, right? The future of keeping alive and keeping species going, as we try as best as we can to reverse the damage that we've done and are continuing to do. We can't at the same time lose entire ecosystems on our planet. So what you're doing is amazing. And, you know, I would never understand any of the science, but I'd love to be kind of a fly on the wall as
Join us anytime.
breakthroughs.
Join us anytime. And you know, we do plan to continue to do outreach to try to communicate, you know, what we're doing, and we'd be happy to have you.
Yeah, I'd love when we're able to come visit. I would love to come visit and take a virtual tour of what you guys are doing, and that would be amazing. So thank you everybody for watching on Facebook. Thank you for everybody watching on Zoom. Please do what you can to advocate for policies so maybe we won't have to do a genetic coral in the future, but we appreciate all you're doing, and thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Muldrow.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dustin. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Have a good one.
You too.